Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one else can see. The great council hall of Silver Ridge carried the warmth of polished oak, burning cedar, and fresh bread cooling somewhere beyond the stone kitchen walls. Morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering ribbons of blue and gold across the long table where every elder, warrior, and healer had already taken a seat. Every chair was filled except one. Arya Whitmore stood quietly beside it, her fingers lightly resting against the carved wooden back as though it were the only thing keeping her balanced. She kept her shoulders relaxed, her expression calm, and her breathing slow, hoping that if she appeared comfortable enough, no one would notice she had not sat down. It never worked. One of the younger warriors muttered just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Most people used chairs for sitting. A ripple of restrained laughter traveled around the room. Arya lowered her eyes, pretending to study the swirling grain in the hardwood floor beneath her boots. She had learned years ago that silence usually ended these moments faster than explanations ever could. Elder Benjamin glanced over the edge of a thick leather ledger before adjusting his spectacles. "Miss Whitmore," he said in a patient voice that somehow carried even greater disappointment than anger, "please take your seat. We have important matters to discuss this morning." Arya swallowed carefully. The familiar knot formed at her throat before she spoke the same 5 words she had repeated countless times over the past 6 years. "It hurts when I sit." The sentence barely rose above a whisper. It drifted into the quiet room almost apologetically, as though she regretted forcing anyone else to hear it again. Another elder sighed heavily. Someone near the windows chuckled. One woman rolled her eyes before returning to her notes. "Every council meeting," another voice murmured. "Always another excuse." Arya felt heat rise into her cheeks, but she did not argue. She remembered every previous attempt. She remembered describing the ache that spread through her lower back after only a few minutes in a chair. She remembered trying different cushions, different benches, different postures. She remembered forcing herself to sit through ceremonies until the pain became so intense that standing afterward felt like climbing a mountain. Each explanation had earned the same reaction. Polite disbelief at first, then impatience, eventually amusement. Somewhere along the way, people stopped asking questions altogether. They simply decided she preferred attention. So Arya had quietly stopped defending herself. Standing became easier than convincing anyone that something invisible could still be real. She volunteered for kitchen duty during feasts because it allowed her to remain on her feet. She carried supplies during celebrations so no one would notice she never accepted a chair. She arrived early to every meeting so she could stand before anyone questioned why she refused to sit. Those small adjustments slowly became her entire life, unnoticed by everyone except herself. Elder Benjamin closed his ledger with a soft thud. "Miss Whitmore," he repeated more firmly, "this council cannot continue making exceptions forever." Arya tightened her grip on the chair until her knuckles turned pale. She wanted to obey. She truly did. Nothing would have made her happier than lowering herself into the empty seat and becoming invisible like everyone else. But she already knew what would happen if she tried. Within minutes, her breathing would shorten. The dull ache would sharpen into something impossible to ignore. By the time the meeting ended, standing again would require every ounce of determination she possessed. Yet explaining that would only invite another smile, another doubtful glance, another quiet laugh. Across the chamber, the massive wooden doors slowly opened with a deep groan that silenced every conversation at once. Boots echoed against polished stone. Royal guards stepped inside first before parting without a word. Between them walked Alpha Kingcale Ashford. His dark coat brushed lightly against the floor as silver morning light caught in his calm gray eyes. The room rose together in perfect respect. Everyone stood. Everyone except Arya, who had never sat down in the first place. For one brief moment, while every other head bowed toward their king, Kale's attention settled on the lone young woman already standing beside an untouched chair, and something almost imperceptible shifted behind his steady gaze. Kale acknowledged the council with a slight, gnawed before taking his place at the head of the long oak table. Yet his attention drifted back to the young Omega almost immediately. Most people revealed themselves through what they said. She revealed herself through what she never did. The empty chair beside her remained perfectly aligned with the table, untouched, as though it had become another permanent piece of furniture rather than a place meant for a person. While Elder Benjamin resumed the morning agenda, Cale listened with the quiet patience that had earned him respect across every neighboring pack, but part of his mind continued observing details no one else appeared to notice. Arya never leaned comfortably against the wall behind her. Every few minutes, she shifted the weight from one foot to the other with such practiced precision that the movement almost disappeared. Her left hand occasionally rested against the back of the chair for only a heartbeat before falling naturally to her side again. None of it appeared dramatic. None of it looked rehearsed. It looked familiar, like habits repeated so many thousands of times they had become invisible even to the person performing them. Around the council table, conversation moved toward harvest reports, winter grain storage, and repairs needed before the first snowfall. Elders exchanged opinions while assistants recorded every decision with neat strokes of ink across thick parchment. Arya remained silent, her pale blue eyes focused somewhere beyond the stained glass windows where pine trees swayed gently beneath the cool autumn breeze. She knew nearly every voice in the room. She also knew exactly what each of them believed about her. The youngest warriors thought she enjoyed attention. Several elders assumed she exaggerated ordinary discomfort because she disliked meetings. Others quietly concluded she lacked discipline. None of those judgments had arrived all at once. They had gathered slowly, one misunderstanding at a time, until they hardened into something that felt impossible to change. 6 years earlier, she had tried explaining. She remembered smiling awkwardly while apologizing for standing through community dinners. She remembered accepting every suggestion with genuine hope. Softer chairs, firmer chairs, extra cushions, stretching before sitting, stretching after sitting. Herbaltea, different sleeping positions. Nothing changed. Eventually, every new explanation sounded weaker than the last because the results never improved. After enough failed conversations, people stopped searching for answers and settled comfortably into assumptions. It became easier for everyone to believe she simply preferred standing than to accept the possibility that something invisible continued hurting her every single day. Arya no longer blamed them aloud. She only adjusted her life around their expectations. She volunteered whenever work required long hours on her feet. She quietly avoided celebrations where everyone remained seated through endless speeches. During festivals, she carried trays, arranged decorations, or helped children so no one would notice. She never accepted an empty chair. She built an entire life around appearing helpful instead of appearing different. The strange part was that almost no one remembered she had once laughed easily. They remembered only the quiet woman who always stood in the corner. Cale folded his hands before him as another elder presented trade figures from neighboring territories. He had attended hundreds of council meetings throughout his reign. Experience had taught him that patterns often revealed truths hidden beneath ordinary conversation. A merchant repeatedly touching his sleeve usually concealed anxiety over an agreement. A captain avoiding eye contact often carried difficult news. Human habits rarely appeared without reason. His gaze returned once more to Arya. If she truly wished to attract attention, she would have looked around after speaking. She would have defended herself against every doubtful glance. Instead, she seemed almost desperate for the room to forget she had spoken at all. That contradiction lingered quietly in his thoughts. Attention seekers rarely hoped to disappear. Outside the towering windows, a light breeze stirred crimson leaves across the stone courtyard, while bells from the village square echoed faintly through the morning air. The peaceful sounds contrasted sharply with the uneasy silence surrounding the young Omega. She remained standing exactly where she had begun, careful, composed, almost invisible despite being the only person in the room without a seat beneath her. Kale watched her adjust her posture once again, a movement so subtle that no one else reacted, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself wondering not whether she was telling the truth, but how many years someone had been forced to carry that truth alone before everyone else decided it was easier not to believe it. The meeting continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but Arya knew exactly what came next because it always came next. Once the official reports began, whispered conversations quietly replaced open laughter. She did not need heightened senses to hear them. Years of living with quiet judgment had taught her how to recognize every lowered voice, every unfinished sentence, every glance that lingered a second too long before quickly looking away. Two council assistants exchanged papers while one of them whispered, "If standing hurts less, why does she never visit the healers?" The other shrugged without lifting his eyes from the parchment. "Maybe because there is nothing to heal." Their words were soft, almost careless, yet they settled over Arya like tiny drops of rain that eventually soaked through everything. None of them intended cruelty. That somehow made the loneliness even heavier. Cruelty could be confronted. Indifference simply continued living its ordinary life. Across the room, several younger wolves quietly discussed preparations for the upcoming harvest festival. One of them laughed. "Do not bother saving her a chair this year. She never uses one anyway." Another answered with an amused smile. "Maybe standing is part of her personality now." They chuckled together before returning to their notes, unaware that every casual remark reached the woman they believed had stopped listening years ago. Arya kept her expression peaceful. She had practiced that expression in polished windows, still ponds, and dark mirrors for so long that it now arrived naturally. Calm faces required less explanation than hurt ones. Inside, however, she found herself remembering another festival 6 autumns earlier when she had still believed people wanted to understand. She had accepted a seat beside her closest friends, determined to prove she could endure the discomfort without complaining. 15 minutes later, she had excused herself with a trembling smile and quietly finished serving food for the rest of the evening because standing felt easier than pretending everything was fine. By the following week, the story had somehow changed. People joked that Arya simply disliked sitting with others. A few months later, they joked that she enjoyed making herself appear mysterious. Another year passed, and the jokes slowly transformed into accepted truth. No one remembered how the misunderstanding had begun. They only remembered the conclusion they had repeated often enough to believe. Elder Benjamin paused the discussion long enough to organize several documents before looking toward Arya again. His voice carried no anger, only weary resignation. "Miss Whitmore, perhaps after today's meeting you should speak with another healer. It would reassure everyone if they confirmed there is truly nothing serious." The suggestion sounded reasonable. It even sounded kind. Yet Arya felt the familiar ache settle somewhere deeper than her back. She had already visited every healer within a day's journey years before. Some offered herbal remedies. Others recommended stretching exercises or warmer baths before bed. One insisted that too much worrying created physical discomfort. None found an answer. After enough unsuccessful visits, even the healers gently suggested that perhaps she had become overly aware of ordinary aches. She thanked each of them before quietly returning home with one more basket of herbs and one less piece of hope. So she simply nodded without speaking. There seemed little purpose in repeating. A story no one expected to end differently. Kale listened carefully to every exchange without interrupting. He noticed something else now, something even stranger than the untouched chair. Whenever someone questioned Arya, she never defended herself by listing old appointments, failed treatments, or years of searching for help. She accepted each doubtful comment with the quiet composure of someone who had grown tired of trying to prove the same truth again and again. That silence did not resemble surrender. It resembled exhaustion. The realization lingered with him long after the conversation moved on. Most deception demanded constant maintenance. It required fresh explanations, louder arguments, and endless persuasion. Arya offered none of those things. She simply stood where she always stood, surrounded by people who believed they already knew her story, while carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who had stopped expecting anyone to ask whether that story had ever been true in the first place. The final pages of the harvest report were barely finished when Elder Benjamin slowly rose from his chair and looked toward Arya once again. His expression carried the restrained patience of someone convinced he was being fair. "Miss Whitmore," he said, folding his hands behind his back, "His Majesty has traveled many miles to review the condition of Silver Ridge. It would not reflect well upon this council if one member continued refusing such a simple request. Please sit with the rest of us." Every conversation faded into silence. Dozens of eyes turned toward the empty chair beside Arya. She felt the familiar pressure building inside her chest long before anyone spoke again. She wanted nothing more than for the moment to disappear. If she remained standing, they would think she was stubborn. If she obeyed, she already knew what the next several minutes would become. She drew one slow breath before quietly lowering her gaze. "I'm trying to be respectful," she said softly. "I truly am." One of the younger council members gave a small laugh that he clearly believed was harmless. "Then prove it." Another elder added, "Surely 5 or 10 minutes cannot be." "Impossible." Around the table, several people nodded in agreement. Their faces showed confidence rather than cruelty. They genuinely believed they were asking for something ordinary. Arya looked toward the polished wooden chair. It appeared no different from every other chair in the room. Smooth oak, a carved backrest, a simple leather cushion prepared by the village craftsman. She remembered sitting in nearly identical chairs at weddings, harvest feasts, school lessons, council gatherings, and family dinners before gradually learning to avoid them all. The chair itself had never frightened her. What came afterward always did. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she loosened her grip on the chair back and lowered herself onto the seat. The room relaxed immediately. Several elders exchanged satisfied glances, believing the disagreement had finally ended. Papers rustled once more as the meeting resumed. Arya folded both hands carefully in her lap and forced herself to keep her breathing steady. The first few moments passed quietly. She almost allowed herself to hope that perhaps today would somehow be different. Then the familiar ache returned. It arrived gently at first, like a distant storm rolling across the mountains. Within another minute, it spread through her lower back before traveling into her hips with an unmistakable heaviness she recognized all too well. She shifted almost imperceptibly, searching for a position that might lessen the growing discomfort. Nothing changed. Outside, autumn sunlight continued pouring through the stained glass, filling the chamber with warm colors that seemed strangely distant now. Elder Benjamin continued discussing winter grain reserves while assistants carefully copied each decision onto fresh parchment. No one noticed that Arya had quietly stopped following the conversation. Her attention narrowed to the simple rhythm of breathing in and breathing out. Across the table, Kale noticed her fingers first. They had gradually intertwined so tightly that the knuckles beneath her pale skin lost nearly all their color. A few moments later, he noticed the subtle tightening across her shoulders. Then came another detail. Every few breaths, she shifted her weight by less than an inch before immediately returning to stillness, as though any larger movement would attract unwanted attention. None of it resembled performance. If anything, she appeared determined to hide every sign that she was struggling. Kale remained silent, observing. He had watched experienced soldiers conceal injuries during negotiations. He had seen diplomats mask exhaustion after days without sleep. People attempting deception often looked outward, checking whether others believed them. Arya never looked around the room. She seemed concerned only with preventing anyone else from noticing what she was enduring. Another minute passed. A single drop of perspiration appeared near her temple despite the cool mountain air flowing through the open windows. She discreetly brushed it away before anyone else could see. Almost no one did. Almost. Kale's eyes never left her. The discussion continued around the table exactly as before, but for him the harvest reports had quietly faded into the background. Something far more important was unfolding only a few feet away. He found himself asking a question no one else in the chamber appeared willing to consider. What if the greatest mistake in this room was not that one quiet Omega refused to sit for 6 years? What if the greatest mistake was that no one had ever wondered why she had tried so desperately to avoid it in the first place? Another page turned. Another report ended. Time seemed to move normally for everyone except Arya. What felt like only a few minutes to the council had already become an exhausting struggle inside her own body. The warm leather beneath her no longer felt like a chair. It felt like a promise she regretted making. She carefully shifted one shoulder, then the other, searching for even the slightest position that might ease the growing pressure. Nothing helped. She kept her face composed because she had spent years learning that visible discomfort only invited more questions than compassion. A quiet breath escaped through her nose. Then another. Her fingers slowly released one another before tightening again around the edge of her skirt. She counted each breath, instead of listening to the discussion about winter roads. 1, 2, 3. If she focused on numbers, perhaps she could keep the pain from reaching her expression. Across the table, Elder Benjamin noticed the movement and interpreted it very differently. "See," he said with an encouraging smile toward the others. "She is managing just fine." A few council members nodded with quiet satisfaction. One assistant even smiled as though a small misunderstanding had finally been resolved. "Perhaps sitting was never as difficult as everyone believed," another elder commented. "Sometimes habit becomes stronger than reality." The words landed softly, almost kindly, yet they carried the weight of every assumption Arya had heard for years. She wanted to explain that enduring something for several minutes did not mean it was painless. She wanted to explain that she was already wondering how she would stand once the meeting finally ended. She wanted to explain that surviving discomfort was not the same as pretending it did not exist. Instead, she remained silent. Experience had taught her that explanations offered during suffering rarely sounded convincing to people who had already decided what the truth should be. Outside, a cool breeze drifted through the open windows, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. It should have felt refreshing. Instead, tiny beads of perspiration continued forming near Arya's hairline despite the crisp mountain air. She discreetly brushed one away before it reached her cheek. Her breathing became slower, more deliberate. Every muscle in her lower back tightened instinctively as though trying to protect something invisible. Kale watched every detail unfold without interrupting. The room believed it was witnessing proof that Arya had exaggerated her condition. He saw something entirely different. He noticed that she never relaxed against the chair even once. She held herself with extraordinary control, leaving the smallest possible amount of weight resting on the seat beneath her. It looked less like comfort than careful endurance. He had seen hunters cross frozen rivers with similar restraint after twisting an ankle. They walked steadily, never asking for help, hoping no one would notice until the journey ended. Pride often disguised suffering more effectively than words ever could. Another council member chuckled quietly. "Perhaps we should have insisted years ago." Soft laughter answered him. Not cruel laughter. Comfortable laughter. The kind shared by people convinced they had finally been proven right. Arya closed her eyes for only a heartbeat before opening them again. She could not remember the last time anyone had laughed, because she looked happy. The sound had become permanently connected to moments like this. She slowly placed both palms against the edges of the chair, preparing herself. She knew the meeting still had several reports remaining. She also knew she could not remain seated much longer. The growing ache had become a deep, relentless pressure that spread through every careful breath. Standing would hurt. Remaining seated would hurt even more. She quietly shifted forward, hoping to rise without interrupting anyone, but the simple movement caused her shoulders to tense before she could stop them. That tiny change escaped nearly everyone in the chamber. Nearly everyone except one man. Kale's silver eyes remained fixed upon her with calm, unwavering attention. For the first time since entering Silver Ridge, he no longer wondered whether something was wrong. He wondered only why an entire room filled with intelligent people had mistaken quiet endurance for comfort for so many years. Arya knew she had reached her limit long before anyone else realized it. She carefully drew one deeper breath, pressed both hands against the edges of the chair, and slowly rose to her feet. The movement itself appeared ordinary to everyone watching. Only she felt the wave of stiffness that followed, forcing her to pause for the briefest moment before she could stand completely upright. She hoped no one had noticed. She should have known better. One council member smiled with quiet satisfaction. "There," he said lightly. "You managed it after all." Another nodded in agreement. Perhaps sitting simply feels unfamiliar after avoiding it for so many years. Gentle laughter drifted across the room once more. No one sounded angry. No one sounded cruel. They sounded relieved, as though reality had finally returned to match the story they had believed all along. Arya lowered her eyes again. She did not correct them. She no longer possessed the strength to explain the difference between enduring something briefly and living without pain afterward. Her lower back continued throbbing with a slow, relentless ache that refused to disappear the moment she stood. She quietly shifted her weight, searching for the position that would allow her to remain still without drawing attention. The adjustment lasted less than a second. Cale noticed it immediately. His attention narrowed further, not toward her face, but toward the tiny movements everyone else dismissed. Her shoulders settled unevenly before correcting themselves. Her right foot accepted slightly more weight than her left. Her breathing remained measured, yet every fourth breath became almost imperceptibly deeper than the ones before it. None of those details appeared dramatic. Together, however, they formed a pattern that experience had taught him never to ignore. During years of leading warriors across difficult terrain, he had watched seasoned trackers conceal sprained knees, exhausted guards disguise sleepless nights, and wounded scouts insist they could continue traveling. The body always revealed truths the voice attempted to hide. Arya's body spoke with remarkable honesty. It never asked for sympathy. It simply adapted, compensated, and endured. Cale slowly looked away from her long enough to study everyone else inside the chamber. Elder Benjamin had already returned to reviewing grain inventories. The assistants dipped fresh quills into ink. Two younger council members quietly resumed, discussing festival decorations. The room had accepted its conclusion with remarkable speed. She sat. Therefore, she must have been exaggerating. The simplicity of that reasoning unsettled him more than he expected. It reminded him how easily people preferred explanations that required no further thought. His father had once told him that leadership demanded seeing what everyone else overlooked. At the time, Cale believed those words referred to military strategy or diplomacy. Sitting inside the council hall now, he began wondering whether they sometimes referred to something much quieter. He turned another page of the meeting notes without reading a single line. His thoughts remained fixed on one impossible question. If Arya truly wanted attention, why had she spent the entire morning trying to hide every sign of discomfort? Why had she apologized before speaking? Why had she accepted years of misunderstanding instead of demanding to be heard? None of it fit together. Across the room, Arya continued standing beside the same chair, her fingers resting lightly against its polished wooden frame once more. That simple gesture struck Cale unexpectedly. The chair had become less a place to rest than something she used to steady herself after forcing her body through another trial. He had watched her treat it that way all morning. Suddenly, the reports around him no longer seemed urgent. The council could debate grain shipments another day. Trade routes could wait another hour. There was only one matter in the chamber that had never truly been discussed. Cale gently closed the leather folder before him. The quiet sound echoed farther than anyone expected. Every conversation stopped. Every elder lifted their head. Even Arya looked toward him in uncertain surprise. Cale remained seated for a calm moment, his silver eyes resting not on the council, but on the young Omega who had spent years standing in silence. When he finally spoke, His voice carried neither accusation nor judgment. It carried only quiet curiosity. "Miss Whitmore," he said gently, "I would like to ask you something that perhaps should have been asked a very long time ago." Silence settled across the council hall so completely that even the crackling fire seemed to soften. Every face turned toward Alpha King Kale, waiting for a command, a judgment, or a reprimand. Instead, he simply looked at Arya with an expression no one in the room expected. There was no suspicion in his eyes, no impatience, only quiet attention. Arya stood motionless beside the chair, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. During the past 6 years, she had answered countless questions. Why would you not sit? Have you tried another cushion? Are you certain it hurts? Are you exaggerating? Each question had assumed the answer before she ever spoke. This one felt different. Kale did not ask whether she was telling the truth. He asked as though the truth already mattered. "Miss Whitmore," he repeated gently, "when did this begin?" The words reached her more deeply than she expected. For a moment, she simply stared at him. She searched his face for the familiar signs of polite disbelief, waiting for the hidden smile that usually followed. None appeared. His expression remained calm and patient, as though time itself had slowed to give her room to answer. Around the table, several elders exchanged puzzled glances. Elder Benjamin cleared his throat softly. "Your Majesty," he began, "she has mentioned discomfort for several years, but no healer has ever found a clear explanation." Kale lifted one hand slightly without looking away from Arya. The simple gesture was respectful, yet it brought the interruption to an immediate end. He was not interested in second-hand opinions. He wanted to hear from the only person who had actually lived the experience. Arya felt something unfamiliar rising inside her chest. It was not relief. Relief belonged to people whose burdens had already ended. This was something quieter. It was the fragile feeling that perhaps for the first time in years, someone intended to listen all the way to the end instead of deciding halfway through. She lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "About 6 years ago," she said softly. "I was 16. No one laughed. The room remained completely still. Encouraged by the silence, she continued. "At first I thought I had simply strained something while helping repair homes after the spring floods. I expected it to disappear in a few days." Her fingers rested lightly against the chair again, not from fear but from habit. Instead, every week it became a little harder to sit comfortably. Standing always felt easier. She hesitated, uncertain whether she had already spoken too much. Kale nodded once, inviting her to continue without using a single additional word. "I visited healers," Arya said quietly. "Many of them. I followed every suggestion they gave me. I rested. I stretched. I drank every herbal remedy they recommended. I tried different chairs, different beds, different ways of sitting. Nothing changed." Her voice remained steady, but something behind it carried years of exhaustion. Eventually, people stopped asking how I was doing. They only asked why I was still standing. Several council members slowly lowered their eyes toward the table. The sentence lingered in the hall long after she finished speaking. Kale noticed another detail. As Arya spoke, she never attempted to make herself sound tragic. She did not exaggerate. She did not seek sympathy. She simply described ordinary days that had quietly become extraordinary burdens. Those were not the words of someone constructing a convincing story. They were the words of someone recalling a life she had accepted because she no longer believed it could be different. Kale folded his hands together thoughtfully. "During those 6 years," he asked in the same calm voice, "did anyone ever ask you that question before today?" Arya blinked. The answer arrived almost immediately, yet speaking it proved unexpectedly difficult. She looked around the chamber at the familiar faces surrounding her. Some had known her since childhood. Others had watched her grow into adulthood. She realized she could not remember a single conversation that had begun with genuine curiosity instead of quiet doubt. Slowly she shook her head. "No, Your Majesty," she whispered. "No one ever asked when it started." Those simple words settled over the council hall with a weight no report, no ledger, and no harvest record had ever carried. For the first time that morning, Kale believed the most important matter before the council had never been grain, trade, or winter preparations. It had been a question that should have been asked 6 years earlier. No one spoke after Arya's answer. The council chamber, so often filled with confident opinions, suddenly seemed unfamiliar with silence. The ticking of the tall grandfather clock near the eastern wall became strangely clear. Outside, a pair of birds settled on the stone fountain in the courtyard, while cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar through the open windows. Life beyond the hall continued exactly as it always had. Inside, however, something had quietly shifted. Kale remained seated, his steady gaze never leaving Arya. He did not rush to fill the silence with comforting words. He understood that some truths deserved room to breathe before anyone tried to explain them away. "Would you tell us what happened after that first spring?" he asked gently. "Only what you were comfortable sharing." Arya hesitated. She had not spoken this much about herself in years. Most people eventually stopped asking because they believed they already knew the ending. Yet the king continued listening as though every sentence mattered. She slowly nodded. "At first I thought I only needed more time," she said. "I continued helping my family. I carried lumber while we repaired damaged cottages. I swept workshops. I prepared meals. Standing never felt easy, but it always hurt less than sitting." She paused before continuing. "When the discomfort became worse, I visited the village healer. He believed strained muscles would recover on their own. When they did not, I traveled to another pack, then another." Several council members exchanged uncertain glances. Few of them had known she had searched so far from home. Arya continued in the same calm voice. "Every healer tried to help. None of them ignored me. They simply could not find a reason. One suggested warm herbal compresses. Another recommended strengthening exercises. Someone else believed stress was making ordinary soreness feel larger than it truly was." She offered a faint, tired smile that carried no bitterness. "I wanted every one of them to be right." Kale listened without interruption. He noticed that Arya never criticized those who had failed to help her. Instead, she spoke with remarkable generosity toward people who had unintentionally disappointed her. That quiet grace made her words feel even more believable. "Did the discomfort ever disappear?" he asked. Arya slowly shook her head. "No, Your Majesty. It only taught me how to reorganize my life." Confusion appeared on several faces around the table. She noticed it and gently explained. "I stopped accepting invitations where everyone remained seated for hours. During celebrations, I volunteered to serve food instead of joining the tables. At festivals, I carried supplies because walking hurt less than remaining in one place. During council meetings, I arrived early, so standing would seem natural before anyone noticed." She looked down at the polished floor. Little by little, everything changed without anyone realizing it. Elder Benjamin frowned thoughtfully. Memories began quietly returning. He remembered Arya arranging decorations instead of watching performances. He remembered her delivering meals during long feasts. He remembered countless meetings where she remained near the walls rather than taking her place at the table. None of those moments had ever seemed unusual because they had happened gradually over so many years. Kale observed the realization spreading across several faces. People were not discovering new events. They were seeing familiar memories through an entirely different lens. "Did you continue asking for help?" he asked softly. Arya took a slow breath before answering. "For a while." Her voice remained steady, but quieter now. "Eventually I noticed that each explanation sounded less believable than the one before it. The more often I said the same words, the more people assumed I was repeating excuses instead of truth. So I stopped explaining unless someone asked directly." She looked around the chamber with gentle honesty rather than accusation. After some time, no one asked anymore. Those final words settled over the room with greater weight than any dramatic speech could have carried. Kale folded his hands thoughtfully. He realized the greatest tragedy before him was not merely that an illness had remained unexplained. It was that an entire community had gradually mistaken silence for recovery. As one year quietly became 6, Everyone assumed the absence of new complaints meant the problem had disappeared, when in reality the person suffering had simply learned to carry it without expecting anyone to understand. The quiet inside. The council hall lingered long enough for everyone to recognize that the meeting had become something entirely different from what had been planned. The ledgers remained open. Ink slowly dried upon unfinished reports. No one reached for another page. Cale rested both hands upon the polished oak table, his expression thoughtful rather than emotional. He had listened to trade disputes, border concerns, and harvest forecasts since sunrise, yet none of those matters now seemed as urgent as the woman who had quietly reorganized 6 years of her life around an invisible burden. He looked toward Elder Benjamin first. How many healers currently serve Silver Ridge? Benjamin answered almost automatically. 3 within the village, Your Majesty, and several others visit during seasonal gatherings. Cale nodded once before asking another question. Has any specialist from the Royal Healing House ever examined Miss Whitmore? Benjamin hesitated. No, Your Majesty. We believe there was no clear reason to request such assistance. Several council members shifted uneasily in their chairs. The answer sounded reasonable until it was spoken aloud. Cale remained calm. No clear reason, he repeated quietly, not as criticism, but as though testing the weight of the words themselves. He turned back toward Arya. Miss Whitmore, if I asked the Royal Healing House to examine you today, would you be willing? Surprise crossed her face almost instantly. She had expected another suggestion, another herbal remedy, perhaps another polite encouragement to remain hopeful. She had not expected the Alpha King himself to offer the finest medical knowledge available in the kingdom. Your Majesty, she answered carefully, I do not wish to waste the time of people who care for those with truly serious illnesses. The sentence settled heavily over the room. Cale noticed that even now she spoke as though her own suffering deserved to stand behind everyone else's. He slowly rose from his chair. The movement drew every eye toward him. No one who has lived with unanswered pain for 6 years is wasting anyone's time, he said gently. Before Arya could respond, one of the senior council members leaned forward with respectful caution. Your Majesty, forgive me, but would it not be wiser to wait until the spring gathering? The Royal Healing House serves the entire kingdom. Surely there are greater priorities than discomfort while sitting. Several others nodded in quiet agreement. Their concern sounded practical rather than unkind. Resources were limited. Travel required planning. The suggestion appeared sensible. Cale listened without interruption. When the elder finished speaking, the Alpha King remained silent for several moments before answering. Tell me, he said calmly, if someone told you every day for 6 years that they were hurting, at what point would that become important enough to investigate? No one answered. The elder lowered his eyes toward the table. Cale continued in the same steady voice. Would 7 years be sufficient? 10? Or should we simply continue hoping the answer appears on its own? The questions carried no anger. That somehow made them impossible to dismiss. Elder Benjamin slowly removed his spectacles and looked toward Arya with an expression she had never seen before. It was not certainty. It was doubt directed toward his own assumptions. Cale stepped away from the head of the table and walked several unhurried steps across the chamber until he stood only a short distance from Arya. He noticed once again that she instinctively shifted her weight after remaining still for too long. He noticed the quiet fatigue resting behind her pale blue eyes. Most of all, he noticed that despite everything she had described, she still looked embarrassed for occupying everyone else's attention. Miss Whitmore, he said softly, I do not know the cause of your condition. He paused briefly before continuing. I do not know whether the Royal Healing House will find an answer immediately. But I do know something else. The entire council watched him in complete silence. Cale met Arya's uncertain gaze with quiet conviction. I believe that your pain deserves to be understood before it is dismissed. For the first time in 6 years, Arya felt something she had almost forgotten existed. It was not certainty that everything would become better. It was something even more fragile than hope. It was the simple realization that someone had chosen to believe her before asking for proof. The council meeting did not continue. Instead, the great hall remained suspended in a thoughtful stillness unlike anything Silver Ridge had experienced in years. Afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the stained glass windows, painting warm shades of gold and sapphire over the polished stone floor, while no one seemed willing to return to grain reports or trade routes. Kale quietly summoned one of the royal attendants standing near the entrance. The young messenger stepped forward immediately, lowering his head in respect. "Ride to the royal healing house," Kale instructed in a calm voice. "Ask Master Healer Evelyn Hart to come to Silver Ridge as soon as her duties safely allow. Tell her I am requesting a full medical evaluation for one member of this pack." The messenger nodded without hesitation and departed at once, the heavy wooden doors closing gently behind him. A soft murmur spread through the council. Master Healer Evelyn Hart was known throughout the kingdom for treating difficult conditions that others struggled to understand. She rarely left the capital except when personally requested by the Alpha King himself. Arya stood perfectly still, almost convinced she had misunderstood what had just happened. She had spent years hoping someone might simply believe she was trying her best. Never once had she imagined the finest healer in the kingdom would travel because of her. Elder Benjamin slowly removed both hands from the table and looked toward Kale with visible uncertainty. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "that journey will require several days. It is a great request for a matter that may still prove ordinary." Kale met the elder's eyes with quiet composure. "Perhaps it will," he answered. "Perhaps it will not. We will not know until someone truly investigates." The elder offered no reply. Deep inside, he realized that he had spent years accepting uncertainty as though it were certainty simply because enough time had passed. Around the chamber, several council members found themselves recalling countless ordinary moments they had never questioned before. They remembered Arya volunteering to remain standing during village feasts. They remembered her carrying baskets while everyone else rested. They remembered offering her chairs that she politely declined with the same gentle smile every single time. Those memories no longer felt ordinary. They felt incomplete. Arya slowly lowered her gaze toward the floor. The weight pressing against her heart had changed in a way she could barely understand. For years, she had prepared herself for disbelief before speaking. Now she found herself uncertain how to respond to kindness instead. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "if the healer finds nothing, I do not want anyone to feel they have traveled in vain." Kale answered without the slightest hesitation. "No search for truth is ever in vain." His voice remained gentle, carrying neither dramatic promise nor unrealistic certainty. "If Master Healer Evelyn confirms there is no underlying condition, then we will finally know that together. If she discovers something others have missed, then we will begin helping you together. Either outcome is better than another 6 years of unanswered questions." Those words settled deeply inside the hall. They were so simple that no one immediately realized how profoundly different they sounded from every conversation that had come before. For 6 years, people had expected Arya to prove her pain before they offered understanding. Kale had quietly reversed that order. He offered understanding first, allowing the search for proof to follow. Elder Benjamin slowly lowered his head. He could no longer remember whether Arya had ever asked the pack for sympathy. Looking back honestly, she had asked for remarkably little. She had simply asked to stand. Somehow, even that had become difficult for everyone else to accept. Outside the council hall, hoofbeats gradually faded into the distance as the royal messenger rode toward the capital. Inside, Arya remained beside the same chair that had become the symbol of so many silent years. It looked exactly as it had that morning, yet somehow everything around it had changed. For the first time since she was 16 years old, the future no longer felt like an endless repetition of the past. Someone had finally chosen to search for an answer instead of another reason to doubt her. 4 days later, the sound of carriage wheels echoed across the stone courtyard of Silver Ridge just as the first rays of morning sunlight reached the highest mountain peaks. Villagers paused in the marketplace, curious to see who would arrive with the royal crest displayed upon the polished carriage door. Elder Benjamin stood at the entrance to the council hall beside Alpha King Kale, while Arya remained several steps behind them, uncertain whether she truly belonged there. She still found herself expecting someone to gently explain that a mistake had been made, that the kingdom's most respected healer had been summoned for someone far more deserving. Instead, the carriage door opened, and a graceful woman with silver threaded through her dark hair stepped onto the stone path, carrying only a leather satchel and a warm, unhurried smile. Master Healer Evelyn Hart greeted the Alpha King with quiet respect before turning her attention toward the young Omega standing near the doorway. She did not begin by examining Arya. She did not immediately ask where it hurt. She simply walked over and extended both hands with calm kindness. "You must be Miss Whitmore," she said gently. "Thank you for waiting for me." The simple words caught Arya completely off guard. During years of visiting healers, she had grown accustomed to apologizing for taking their time before every appointment even began. No one had ever thanked her. She quietly nodded. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. Evelyn smiled reassuringly. "You have already carried this alone for a very long time. There is no need to carry the conversation alone as well." Kale watched the exchange without interruption. Something about the healer's approach immediately felt different. She was not searching for a quick explanation. She was creating a place where honest answers could exist. Rather than leading Arya into the crowded council chamber, Evelyn requested a smaller, healing room overlooking the herb garden behind the hall. Sunlight filtered through wide windows where lavender, rosemary, and chamomile gently swayed beneath the cool autumn breeze. A wide-cushioned bench rested beneath the largest window, replacing the ordinary wooden chairs found elsewhere in the building. Evelyn noticed Arya hesitate near the doorway. "Please," she said softly, gesturing toward the cushioned bench instead. "Choose whichever position feels most comfortable. We begin by listening to your body rather than asking it to ignore itself." Arya slowly settled onto the bench with visible caution. Almost immediately her shoulders relaxed slightly, not because the discomfort disappeared, but because she no longer felt pressured to endure unnecessary pain simply to appear polite. Evelyn noticed the change without commenting on it. She pulled a notebook from her satchel, but kept it closed. "Tell me your story," she said. "Not the version people have interrupted. The whole story." Minutes passed while Arya spoke without once being hurried. She described the first spring after the floods, the gradual changes that followed, every healer she had visited, every treatment she had faithfully attempted, every celebration she quietly worked through instead of attending, every council meeting she spent standing near the wall. Evelyn listened without writing a single note. She asked gentle questions only when something needed clarification. Which movements ease the discomfort? Does walking feel different from remaining seated? What happens after you stand again? None of her questions suggested doubt. Each one suggested curiosity. Outside the healing room, the council waited in unusual silence. Elder Benjamin slowly paced beside the garden gate, while several council members sat quietly beneath the old maple trees. Kale remained near the window overlooking the herb beds, his thoughts returning again and again to the same realization. Years earlier, the pack had searched for quick answers. When those answers failed to appear, they had gradually stopped asking meaningful questions altogether. Inside the healing room, Arya finally reached the end of her story. She looked down apologetically before saying the words she had spoken. "Countless times to countless healers. I know it probably sounds strange." Evelyn gently shook her head before Arya could say another word. "No," she replied with quiet certainty. "It sounds like someone who has spent 6 years trying to describe something that too few people were willing to hear. Let us begin there." The examination lasted much longer than anyone outside expected. Morning sunlight slowly gave way to the softer glow of early afternoon as Master Healer Evelyn Hart patiently guided Arya through a series of careful movements. She never rushed. She never dismissed even the smallest detail. Instead of asking whether something hurt, she asked when it changed, what relieved it, what made it worse, and how long the relief lasted. She observed the way Arya naturally shifted her balance after remaining seated, the careful pace she adopted when rising, and the instinctive way her hand reached for nearby support without fully leaning on it. Every movement revealed another piece of a puzzle that had remained unfinished for years. At last, Evelyn closed her notebook and remained thoughtfully silent for several moments. Arya waited with lowered eyes, preparing herself for another gentle apology, another explanation that no clear answer could be found. Instead, Evelyn smiled with quiet confidence. "Miss Whitmore," she said softly, "I believe I understand far more today than anyone has understood before." Arya looked up in surprise. Evelyn continued carefully. "Your condition appears entirely genuine. The patterns you describe, combined with what I observed this morning, are remarkably consistent. While additional evaluation will help us understand every detail, I do not believe you imagined your pain, exaggerated your discomfort, or misunderstood your own body." The words settled gently into the room. Arya did not react immediately. She simply stared at the healer, almost unable to accept what she had heard. For 6 years, she had searched for certainty and slowly convinced herself that perhaps certainty no longer existed. Hearing another person calmly acknowledge the reality she had lived every day felt almost overwhelming. Evelyn reached across the small table and placed her notebook aside. "There are conditions that do not reveal themselves through ordinary examinations," she explained. "Sometimes the body asks for someone willing to watch carefully before it is willing to reveal its story. Your body has been speaking for years. Very few people knew how to listen." A quiet knock sounded at the healing room door. Cale entered only after receiving permission, his expression composed but attentive. He immediately noticed the difference in Arya's face. The tension she had carried since the council meeting had not disappeared, yet something within her eyes seemed lighter, as though the burden of proving herself had finally begun to lift. Evelyn stood to greet the Alpha King. "Your Majesty," she said respectfully, "I cannot provide every answer today. That would require additional evaluation and continued care. However, I can confidently tell you one thing." Cale waited patiently. "Miss Whitmore's condition is real." No dramatic reaction followed. Cale simply closed his eyes for the briefest moment before opening them again with quiet gratitude. He had not requested the examination because he expected to be proven right. He had requested it because he believed unanswered suffering deserved honest attention. Still, hearing those words carried a weight he could not ignore. Together, they returned to the council chamber, where the elders and village representatives immediately rose from their seats. The room felt different than it had only a few days earlier. No one whispered. No one smiled knowingly. Every face reflected quiet anticipation. Evelyn stepped forward first. "After a thorough evaluation," she announced calmly, "I have found no evidence that Miss Whitmore has been pretending, exaggerating, or imagining her condition. On the contrary, her symptoms follow a consistent pattern that deserves continued medical care, proper support, and understanding." Silence swept through the chamber. Elder Benjamin slowly removed his spectacles, holding them loosely in one hand as he looked toward Arya. Memory after memory returned with painful clarity. Every time she had remained standing, every polite refusal of a chair, every quiet smile offered instead of another explanation. None of those moments now resembled stubbornness. They resembled quiet endurance. Around the hall, several council members lowered their eyes toward the polished floor. No one argued with the healer's conclusion. No one searched for another explanation. For the first time in many years, the room did not see Arya as someone asking to be believed. They finally saw her as someone who had been telling the truth all along. Several weeks passed before the first snow settled gently across the rooftops of Silver Ridge. The village looked unchanged from a distance. Children still laughed through the market square. Bakers still greeted the morning before sunrise. The council bell still rang at the same hour each week. Yet beneath those familiar routines, something quiet and lasting had begun to grow. Master healer Evelyn Hart returned twice more, bringing carefully designed treatments, specialized exercises, and simple adjustments that ease the strain on Arya's body little by little. She never promised miracles. She promised patience, consistency, and respect for what the body revealed over time. For the first time in 6 years, Arya measured her future in possibilities instead of limitations. She no longer wondered whether anyone believed her. She focused instead on learning how to heal. On the morning of the Winter Council meeting, Arya walked into the great hall with the same calm posture she had always carried. Out of habit, her eyes drifted toward the familiar place beside the wall where she had stood through countless meetings. She took one step in that direction before stopping. Something had changed. Near the council table stood a beautifully crafted chair unlike any other in the room. It was neither larger nor more elaborate than the others. Its craftsmanship was thoughtful rather than extravagant. The height had been carefully adjusted. The seat offered gentle support. The backrest followed the natural curve of the spine instead of forcing a rigid posture. A small cushion rested neatly upon it, stitched by the village artisans using soft blue fabric that matched the colors of Silver Ridge. No plaqué identified it. No one pointed toward it. It simply waited where every chair should have waited from the beginning. Arya looked at it in quiet disbelief. Elder Benjamin approached her slowly, holding his hands together with unusual humility. For a long moment, he searched for words that felt worthy of 6 years of silence. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "I spent a long time believing that because I never intended to hurt you, I had done nothing wrong. I understand now that good intentions are not always enough." His voice carried no excuses. "I cannot return the years you spent standing alone. I can only promise that we will listen better than we did before." Arya looked at the elder she had known since childhood. She saw genuine regret rather than obligation. She answered with the same quiet kindness that had always lived within her. "Thank you for listening now." No dramatic speeches followed. None were necessary. As the other council members entered the hall, they noticed the chair and then looked toward Arya with expressions that had quietly changed. The smiles of quiet amusement had disappeared. In their place came respectful nods, gentle greetings, and simple acts of consideration that should never have felt extraordinary. Alpha King Kale entered last. He paused only briefly as his eyes found Arya standing beside the new chair. He did not announce that he had commissioned it. He did not seek recognition for arranging the healer's visits or changing the council's customs. Leadership, he believed, did not need applause when compassion had already accomplished its purpose. As the meeting began, Arya slowly lowered herself into the chair. She adjusted her position naturally, following the guidance Evelyn had taught her. For the first time in years, she remained seated without forcing herself to hide unbearable discomfort. She breathed in quietly. She listened to the discussion around her. She contributed her thoughts when asked. Nothing about the moment appeared remarkable to anyone passing outside the hall. Yet to Arya, it felt extraordinary because she was no longer spending every minute wondering whether someone believed her. Before closing the meeting, Kale rose one final time. His voice remained calm, carrying easily across the chamber. "Today," he said, "we adopt a new principle for every council, every healer, every leader, and every family within Silver Ridge. Before we judge what another person carries, we will first choose to listen." No one objected. No vote was required. The lesson had already been written into every heart present. As the council ended and warm winter sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, Arya remained seated for one peaceful moment, looking across the hall that had once felt so lonely. She realized that the greatest gift she had received was not the chair, the treatment, or even the confirmation that her pain had been real. It was discovering that one person willing to ask the right question with genuine compassion could change the story of an entire community. And sometimes the strongest alpha was not the one who commanded the loudest voice, but the one who chose to believe someone long before the proof ever arrived.